Well, hello everyone. Editing Val here at the top of this episode to bring you an announcement. Facebook has permanently disabled me and I am unable to access the Motherhood Experience page on Facebook. As a result, we will no longer be having posts or a presence there. If you would like to hear the whole story behind this situation, there is a blog post on the motherhoodexperience.com. You can go over there and read all about it. I am still active on Instagram and YouTube at this time. However, this brings to light something that I feel like I need to bring to you, and that is the only guaranteed way for me to stay in touch with you is if we can email one another. In case Instagram or YouTube also randomly decide to permanently disable me, I would encourage you to head to themotherhoodexperience.com/learn more. There you can just enter your name, email address, and when or if any of these things happen in the future, I can get in touch with you that way. Thank you, as always, for listening to the Motherhood Experience. These stories are powerful, wonderful, and deserve to be heard. And with that, let's get into our episode.
You're listening to the Motherhood Experience, a podcast where you are part of the conversation with moms, for moms, and by moms. Let's jump into this episode with me, your host, Val Kleppen.
Welcome back, friends, to another week and another episode of the Motherhood Experience podcast. I am honored, privileged, thrilled to release this episode for you today. I cannot tell you what it meant to me to record this story. You are going to want to share this episode. I promise you. Selfishly, I say that because by sharing the episode, of course, you know that you please the algorithm with the Motherhood Experience and it pushes it out to more people. But this is one that more people are going to be changed by. I am not exaggerating. My conversation with my guest today, Brenda Coombs, is one I will remember for the rest of my life. Brenda lives in my hometown. However, we had never met prior to this conversation. We know a lot of the same people. And because of that, I had come to learn about and know parts of her story over the last several years. But I didn't know all of it and certainly had never spoken with her about it. I'm going to tell you right now, grab your tissues and keep them close. This is the longest episode of the Motherhood Experience that I have published to date. I don't dare break this up into part one or part two. This is one that I am trusting you, the listener, to work through at your own pace as you are able, and you will need to hear the entire story. Not only is it the longest episode I've published to date, but it is the most tender, emotional, hard story that I have ever facilitated being shared on this podcast. And if you've been listening for any amount of time, you know that we are no stranger to difficult, sad, hard stories. Brenda's story is unlike any you will probably ever hear. I'm so grateful to her for trusting me to share it with the rest of you. And I just encourage you to settle in, grab the Kleenex, but be enriched, be encouraged, and be blessed by what she has to share. As always, friends, it is a blessing and a privilege to come to you each week and share these motherhood stories with each of you. I pray that you enjoy this episode. And now on to my conversation with our guest this week, Brenda Coombs. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Motherhood Experience podcast, where I am joined by my guest, Brenda Coombs. Brenda, it's so good to have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well. It's good to be here.
Yes. Brenda is married to one of my classmates and friends with Tiffany Asher from way back in episode 2. If you haven't heard Tiffany's episode, it's a good one. Brenda, I know little bits of your story and am so honored that you are going to share it with us today. I start every episode with ages and stages of kids and motherhood. So why don't you introduce us to your family with that?
Okay. So I have 7 kids, 9 if you count my in-laws, my daughter and son-in-law. I have a son who is 23, and he is in the Marine Corps stationed in Arizona. And he met his wife when he was stationed in North Carolina. And unfortunately, at the time that he moved to Arizona, they were estranged. So they are currently living in separate states across the United States from each other, but they are working on reconciling. So my hope is that God's going to really have his hand in all of that and
Yes.
bring them back
Amen.
together. And then, so my son is Reese and his wife is Ashley. And then I have a daughter, Madison, who's 21, and her husband's name is Cash. And they live about 3.5 hours away in Casper. She's going to college, and he works hard with cement. So he's a blue collar guy, and they're pretty awesome. And neither my son nor my daughter is cooperating with me and giving me grandkids. So that's kind of a bummer deal.
Careful.
Someday I'm hoping for grandkids. And then I have my 2 younger children, Peyton and Phoenix. Peyton was my free spirit, and Phoenix was my wild child. Peyton and Phoenix would be, Peyton would be 20 and Phoenix would be 17. And they passed away together in a car accident in February of 2022 when they were 15 and 17. So they are together with our Lord. So I am a mother of 2 adult kids and grieving mother of 2 kids who are no longer with us. And then I've also just kind of stepped into a new stage of motherhood about a year ago. I'm a stepmother to 3. So Grace is 20. She goes to college here in our hometown and lives in the dorms. And then we've got Mason, who is 17. He'll be a junior this year. And we've got Kane, who is 12, who is going into middle school this year. And we have Mason and Kane half-time. So for 2 weeks out of the month, we're empty nesters. And then 2 weeks out of the month, we're parents to a high schooler and a middle schooler.
Oh, wow. So already in this introduction, I know that we have a lot to uncover. But tell me about kind of your life growing up. What kind of a family were you a part of? And did you always envision that family and being a mom would be part of your future?
I grew up in a single parent household. My mom and dad were divorced when I was 1. And so my mom kind of for a few years was off and on with other men. She was married a couple more times. And so I had dads kind of coming in and out of my life. But my dad has been married since I was 1 to the same woman. So I just was part-time with my dad, really not very often, but mostly with my mom. So a couple things that I learned from that is that I never wanted my kids to be part of a broken home. So I wanted to always be sure that if I was going to get married, it would be a commitment that I made for life. But I ended up getting pregnant before I got married, and my late husband just kind of said, okay, we need to get married or break up. And so it was a huge decision to make because, like I said, I never wanted my kids to come from divorce or to have that kind of baggage. So we ended up getting married and just kept getting pregnant after we got married. And then it was a very hard marriage, but we did end up making it till death do us part, which I guess is a victory. But he was an addict and he took his own life when my kids were 10, 12, 14, and 16. So there was a tragic ending to that marriage, but I'm thankful for the things that I learned that I can take with me during that time of my life, and for my kids.
Yeah. So what was your motherhood like, parenting your 4 kids when their dad was struggling with addiction and unpredictability?
Yeah, Kyle, there's so much to say about that. There was a period of time where I felt so out of control. I just felt like, because I had made this decision and this commitment that I took seriously, that I couldn't have, I had no control over what my kids were or were not exposed to, whether they knew it or not. And during that time, I just whined and cried all the time to the Lord about how my life was so out of control and there was nothing I could do. And my husband was this addict and I didn't want those things in my life. Well, I mean, to back it up a little bit, I was also an addict. And I came to the Lord when I was 21. And the Lord really was working in me about Him being what fulfills me, and really teaching me that through seeking, that I was seeking things to fill me that never were going to. And so I was still in a way an addict when I met my husband, because we were still smoking weed. But when I got pregnant with my son, and honestly, I was like, I'm always going to smoke weed, But when I got pregnant with my son, the Lord was just like, is this really something that you want in your life? Is this really something that you want to teach your children, that they should be seeking anything but me to fill the voids in their lives? And so I was firm in wanting to step away from that life, but my husband wasn't. And so then there was that turmoil, and he also was an alcoholic and a meth addict, but he would binge on meth. So there were 3 big binges throughout our relationship. So I just really didn't want that to be part of my kids' lives, but I had made this commitment that I took seriously. I also did not want them to be divorced. And finally, the Lord brought me to this place where I started to seek Him about the things that I could be in control of, because I was just crazy and angry and bitter about the things that I could not control. And I was creating chaos in my home because of that. And so I ended up going back to school. I had 4 little ones at home. My oldest was in kindergarten when I went to school. I was a high school dropout, had gotten my GED and started college. And there was something that broke there when I started to really focus on the things that the Lord could do in me to make my home His, as opposed to always focusing on the ways that my life was out of control and I couldn't live it the way I wanted to. And so just that shift in perspective, really asking the Lord to help me walk through things that He wanted me to walk through in order to make my home His, it made all the difference in the world for my life. So went back to school, got my degree, started working, doing the best that I could to love my husband, and then really started seeking the Lord for His guidance and His presence in creating just a peaceful home environment. Even though addiction brings chaos, God is bigger. God is bigger than that. And He brings peace. And so that's kind of how we negotiated his addictions. And and so then it was with his final meth binge. He'd been using again for about a year and was really just falling apart. And I had been seeking the Lord for quite some time on what to do. And up until that point, every time I sought the Lord about my marriage or about what to do with my husband or with the addiction, the Lord's answer was always, love your husband. Like, I have called you to give me your heart and trust me with your heart and to love your husband. And that's what you need to do. But at that time, when he was getting so deep again into the meth, the Lord just released me to go. Not to leave my marriage, but to just physically take my kids and leave the home, because that was not a healthy environment for my kids to be in. And he had some choices to make, because it wasn't the life that either one of us wanted for our children. It's not safe to stay in a home where there's meth. And so I separated from my husband on Friday, and he ended up taking his own life on Saturday. So I thought I was prepared for anything, but I really was not prepared for that to be his decision.
How did you find out that he had taken his life?
I had the kids spend the night at a friend's house who lived about half an hour away while I was moving out. And then I was going to have them come to the new house and then explain things to them. My older two kind of knew, my younger two didn't. So it was the day after I hadn't heard from him all day, and the kids were just about to show up, and he sent me a song. And I said to him, I know this is hard. I miss you too. Please get clean so that we can move forward together. Please choose sobriety so we can move forward together as a family. And he said, no, it's over. It's done. And so I ended up, we had a bit of an exchange. He said, he was a drywaller. He had a drywall business. So he said, you need to collect a check from here. This bill needs to be paid. This person needs to be paid. The garage door is locked. The house door is unlocked. So he just was making plans for me to take care of the things that he knew needed to be done for his business. And so
when he was telling you these things, did it start to come together? What was happening?
It did. And he had kind of made threats the previous night, and I had called the police to go check on him. But the police have some guidelines that they have to. I wanted the police to take him because so much. When I was moving out, when I was making plans to move out, it was a surprise to him in a way, but we had talked a lot about how the kids and I could not stay in that environment. So the moment was a surprise, but he knew, he had to have known it was coming. It wasn't a good environment. But I had called around to see if I could find a place at least for him to go to detox so that when we left, he would have a place to go. And unfortunately, because we have health insurance and it was January and our deductible was not met, they wanted money up front. So something like $14,000 or $17,000 up front for him to spend days. It felt so defeating to me that he couldn't go and get help when I left. So the first night after I left, when he was making threats, but they were veiled, and he didn't say it the correct way for the police to be able to take him to get help. Because if the police can take him and turn him in, they wouldn't need the $14,000 or $17,000 up front. So when they went to see him, he didn't say it correctly. He didn't say, I am going to kill myself. I have a plan. Or they could have taken him and he could have had help. But when he was texting me the following day, I went to the police station with his text messages, and they knew there was a gun safe in the garage with guns in it. And so they knew that he had access to guns. So they had to take time to pull together a plan to go and see him. And what ended up happening is while I was still at the police station, the very last thing he texted me, he was going back and forth between, I'm so sorry and I hate you. Why would you do
Sure.
this to me?
Sure.
And the very last thing he texted to me was, enjoy. It's happening now. Enjoy. And so it took quite some time for them to get to the garage because suicide by cop is a very real thing. I understand that they needed to take the time to formulate a plan. But when they got to him in the garage, he didn't use a gun. He started up 2 generators and laid down in front of them in the garage, which is actually, it helped to make meaning out of things for the kids and I, because all of our stories are already written. And if it was his time to go, regardless of how it happened. But because of the way that he chose to do it, we were able to donate all of his organs, which helped us to make meaning out of his passing. It didn't take away the grief and the trauma of all of it, but it was such a beautiful time for us in the hospital, spending time with him and they sent a counselor from the organ donation organization to spend time with us and to say goodbye and to know that his life and his death were being used to give life to other people. Like, that was such a huge thing for us.
You were expecting the kids to come to you that evening.
Mm-hmm.
How did you relay the news to your kids?
It was not at all how I wanted things to go, of course, but I wanted to be there because they were finding out this huge thing that their parents were separating. And so the way that my plan was to, bring them into the new home and to be able to spend time talking with them and answering questions and supporting them. But what ended up happening is that my mom and my aunt were here to help. And so I was able to see the kids for a moment. And then my mom and I went to the police station and my aunt stayed with the kids. And then we ended up at the hospital. And then he was life flighted to Billings. So my aunt had to stay with the kids and then take them to Billings without. My oldest was 16 and he was demanding answers from my aunt. He heard the life flight helicopter fly over, and my younger kids were just scared and didn't know what was going on. And I don't believe in white lies. I don't believe in any lie is okay. And
right.
So I didn't want to say your dad's been in an accident because
right.
it wasn't an accident. This was something that was intentional. So I'm trying to think back. I think it was more your dad's been hurt. And then throughout the next few days, then we really started to unpack what had happened. And I remember my youngest, who was 10, taking me aside and just saying, Mom, I have to know why. I have to know why. I have to know why. And I said, we did in a really the best way that I could. I explained to him that Dad had been making some choices that weren't okay, and he was using meth, and that just was not a healthy environment for the kids to stay in. And I was really clear with them, as with my husband as well, that my choice to leave was not leaving the marriage. It was just that we needed to physically be out of that environment, and he needed to make some choices. in order for that to be a safe environment for us to live in. And the kids, and so after I told my youngest, he was really adamant that I needed to tell his sister, who was 12, because my older two, I communicated a little more with them about what was going on. And even when they knew that I was moving out, or that we were moving out, and they never would have had to know that he was using meth if he wouldn't have made the decision to kill himself. They just knew that Dad was doing some things that were not healthy for us, and that he needed to make some decisions. And so we've just over the course of the next few days, we unpacked a little more detail. I was a little more detailed with them about why we had left and why it was necessary. And the kids have always been so gracious with me and never blamed me for the choice that their dad made. Always thankful to me for protecting them while in the midst of dealing with the trauma and the grief and that added layer of Dad just not wanting to be in the world anymore. You know, it was drugs are so deceitful, because we had a really great life. And I told him that quite often. You know, we had what we were building, and what we had built from where we had come from was really great. And we had great kids, but the drugs just were lying to him that he couldn't live the life that we had built without using. And it's a total deception. So yeah. I said to him, just try it and see, because we have a great life.
Yeah. You kind of answered a little bit my next question in, going from an intense marital situation, fighting for your marriage the best way you knew how under the Lord's direction, to the intense situation of your husband taking his life and that not being reconciled. And I was going to ask if you had ever felt, the weight of guilt in any of this, but it sounds like your kids were more of a blessing to you in this process afterwards than a responsibility, even though like you all were carrying each other, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And this is really interesting, when you mention the word guilt, because I never felt guilty about his choice.
Yeah.
But I have since the kids died, I've gone to counseling. I sent all of them to counseling, but I hadn't gone myself. And through that, I was living under this intense guilt. And it's not that he killed himself, but that in the first place, he used meth on our first date. And his first big binge was before we got married. And he knew how I felt about it on our first date, because it was something that the Lord was bringing me out of. Yeah. Because, I was very rebellious, and I made some really ugly choices before the Lord came into my life, or before I chose to accept the Lord in my life. And so as we were going through the first stages of our marriage, when I was talking about that in counseling, I was living under this intense guilt that I didn't get out of the relationship in the first place. And so I felt like it was my fault that my kids had to live with that my kids had a dad who chose not to stay. And so because I chose to stay in the relationship before they even came along. But what the Lord really taught me through bringing that to the surface is that the Brenda that I was then is not the same as the Brenda that I am now. And I was doing the best that I could with the tools that I had. And I can have grace for myself. And it's not my fault. And I was I was doing the best that I could at the time. And I really just wanted to be loved at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And I stayed in that relationship. And, I am so thankful, as I said earlier, I'm so thankful that for the lessons that the Lord has taught me along the way. So,
Yeah. I also imagine that being a widow
mhm.
and being a single mother, while they stemmed from the same circumstance, were probably very different scenarios in their own way. Am I correct in assuming this?
Okay. Can you just
Well, like,
clarify a little bit?
sure. It makes sense in my head. So being a widow, not having a husband's
Mm-hmm.
income, provision, care to come home to. I mean, and I know that was probably, that part of it was not as available to you before he died. But just reconciling with, you're no longer a wife, but
Mm-hmm.
not only are you no longer a wife, you are the only one responsible, providing for, financially, physically, for 4 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so was there an emotional struggle in trying to reconcile those two roles that you now had?
Yeah. Yeah, there was. Well, and then on top of it, the added layer of dealing with the trauma and the grief, my own trauma and grief, and then the collective trauma and grief of our family, and then also just the individual kids. Financially, the kids did get Social Security, which was a huge blessing. So between my income and the Social Security, I for a while there, I worked a second job so that I could give us some cream to go and do the things that we wanted to do. So between my job and the Social Security, my budget was covered. And I ended up, God is so good, because we had destroyed our credit, and we'd worked really hard to build that back up. And then when our credit was good, one of the things that was such a burden for my husband was that he chose to go and buy nice things on credit again. And so that was a financial burden for him. But because not everything that he bought was on, my name wasn't on everything. So I let everything go that his name was on, and I kept and just sought the Lord to maintain my own credit. And so I was able financially to make ends meet for the things that I was responsible for. But it felt really unfair that all of the weight that he had, that he felt like he couldn't live without using drugs, or that he felt like he couldn't live with all of these burdens without using drugs. Yeah. He poured on to my shoulders and then some. But yeah, thankfully, we're not designed to carry the burdens on our own. That's why we have Jesus, and he wants us to give him the weight of our burdens. And even though it still feels heavy at times, he shows us, and he's there for us, and he's faithful to us, and he walks us through those tough times. And so that financially, we were cared for. And I mean, some situations weren't ideal, but if it's gifts that the Lord's given you, you continue to walk through life and doing the best that you can with the tools that you have, And so, yeah, navigating widowhood and single motherhood are definitely, there is a separation, even though there's some things that intertwine, because there isn't another parent there. And there is a part of me that's thankful that and it sounds like a terrible thing to say, but if he would have chosen meth And my kids would have had to watch him self-destruct over choose self-destruction over being a dad and a husband and seeking health in all ways. If they would have had to watch him do that, that would have been pretty terrible for them too. And so I had prayed for a long time for my family to be free of his addictions, and in a way that never would have been anticipated, we were free.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But we had this whole other circumstance to walk through, and it wasn't easy.
Right.
And it was painful. And it still is painful for my kids.
Absolutely. I think anyone would expect that.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to, I mean, your oldest was 16 when this happened. Your youngest was 10.
Mm-hmm.
So not at ages where they're unable to think about or, have to process through these things.
Mm-hmm.
So that journey was playing itself out in front of you as their only living parent now.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about Peyton and Phoenix.
Okay. So Madison and Reese had graduated high school. They were out of the house. And Peyton and Phoenix were my only two left at home. And Peyton was a junior and Phoenix was a freshman. And I work in a different school district than the one that we live in. And my older two kids made the decision to stay in the school district that we live in. But it really became apparent that my older two kids were in a position where they had to take too much responsibility for their younger siblings after Dad was gone, because I was working in a different town. So when they were in middle school, Peyton and Phoenix were in middle school, I went ahead and made the decision to transfer them over to the district that I work in, which is about 35 minutes away or so. So it's not a terrible commute for me, but it did make life kind of tough for them in the sense that they didn't live in the same town that their friends were in. So that was a challenge for them. So when Peyton got her driver's license, she was a cheerleader. So she often would have to stay in town later for practice, and Phoenix sometimes would want to stay in town with her so that he could be with his friends. So I got her a car, and she would drive them to school. When Phoenix was still in middle school, I'm a middle school teacher. So when he was still in middle school, he would ride to school with me. But then once he got into high school, he rode to school with Peyton. So one morning on their way to school, it was snowing and the roads were slick, and they ended up getting in a car accident, and that's where they passed away. So right on the way to school in the morning.
Brenda, how did you find out that they had been involved in an accident?
Well, I'm again thankful for tender mercies. I mean, God is so good. They were behind me, just shortly behind me. I had left the house first, so I'm so thankful for that. And about the time that I was pulling into school, I had another teacher, actually, I think another classmate of yours, Katie Hernandez.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So she teaches as well. She's a high school teacher. So she had taught Peyton, and she was currently teaching Phoenix. And she texted me and said, Brenda, I don't want to freak you out, but did you see the car accident? I couldn't tell if it was Peyton's car, but it was red. And I want to make sure that they're okay. And so I got onto my Life 360. or actually first I tried calling both of them. And then I got onto my Life 360 where I can see just a location sharing app. So you can see the location, and they were stopped at this one spot. And this is ironic. So it's the place where it's a dip where you lose service for a minute. So I always called it the dead spot. And so,
Yeah.
So when I said it after the accident, I said it to my mom, and she was like, I'm like, it's just where I lose service. I didn't mean, yeah. So it was right in that dip where I would lose service. So the kids' phones were pinging at a different place. So I thought that, so I stopped at the front door and talked to my principal. I said, I think my kids have been in an accident. I need to go. And as I was leaving the school, I called Katie and said, this is where their phones are pinging. Is that where you saw the accident? And she said, yeah, it is. And I said, will you please see if they've shown up to school? Will you let me know? And they, I think there was this whole other set of trauma and circumstances that happened at the middle school and the high school. Like there was this, it was a pretty terrible day for the little small town that I work in. So I went back to the scene of the accident, and nobody would answer my questions. I kept saying, my kids are in the red car, and nobody would answer my questions. But I just felt that I should not go to look inside of the red car. Like I just knew. I mean, first responders were there working on the blue car. Nobody was at the red car helping. And I just knew that I shouldn't look in the red car. But Phoenix's phone had pinged at the before they lost service for that small amount of time. So I thought there was a chance that maybe Phoenix had been thrown from the car with his phone. So since nobody was answering my questions and I just needed something to do besides just stand there, I just took my phone and walked to see if I could find Phoenix, and he wasn't there. So he was in the car. So it was quite, yeah. And it was really interesting because it was just after the 5-year anniversary of Zach's death, and who was my previous husband, 2 Zachs. But there was this, when the highway patrol finally confirmed to me that they were gone, like there was this physical ache that was so familiar from losing Zach that just came back immediately. And it was just it was like my body was like, oh, we know how this feels. Let's just slip right back into this physical feeling. And it was terrible. So.
Well, and in 5 years, you lost half of your family,
Mm-hmm.
tragically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was your prayer in those moments once you knew?
I said, I said, God, please take this cup from me. Please take this cup from me. I cannot do this. And he said, you're going to have to finish that prayer. And I said, well, not my will, but yours be done. Not my will, but yours. But I'm not, yeah. I know that there's no comparison to what was done for us on the cross. But in that moment, I could really understand the human side of Jesus, just begging the Lord to make his circumstance not what it was, because he knew how much it was going to hurt. And so that was my prayer. Take this cup from me. And the Lord said, if you're going to use the words of Jesus, you're going to have to finish. So
How did you tell Reese and Madison what had happened?
So I had called them both initially. And I called Reese. He was in North Carolina. I said, I need you to come home. I'm at this accident and I don't know. But I need you to come home. And Madison, same. You need to come home. Oh, gosh, I'm trying to remember. Trauma is such an. I may have overlooked calling her back to tell them that it was confirmed that they were gone. But my mom and my sister live in the same town, and they went and got her. My sister may have called her because my mom, it's hard to put details together. But
yeah.
I know that I called them both initially and said, I know I'm going to need you to come home. Something has happened. I don't know, but they've been in an accident. And Reese, poor Maddie she was alone in her apartment. And so she has her own story of collapsing in the weight of that moment of traumatic loss. And then my mom and sister went and got her so that they could bring her home. And Reese went. He had to go because he's in the military. He had to go to an office to book his plane tickets and to get leave. And he walked outside of the office and collapsed in the parking lot. And a commanding officer that he didn't know, but it was a commanding officer of the whole base, pulled up and just jumped out of his car and just put his arms around Reese and just held him. I think anybody that's been through the loss of someone like that can relate to that collapse and loss of control, like complete loss of control of saying what you're saying, how you're crying, body just completely losing control of anything in that moment.
Were all four of your kids, were they pretty close with one another?
Oh, very close. Something happened when we lost Zach. And it's kids almost, because of the nature and development of kids, it's really, they don't see outside of themselves as they're growing up. I mean, we start to learn to see outside of ourselves the older that we get and the more that we mature. But something happened when they lost their dad, and it made them see the world and see our family and see life in a different way. And they just developed this appreciation for who they did have left. And it was just, there was a depth to that. Not that they didn't fight like normal siblings do, because they did, but they were incredibly close, especially Reese and Maddie and Peyton and Phoenix. I mean, Peyton and Phoenix were best buds. And so were Reese and Maddie, but then the four of them together were great friends as well. When I had a boy and then 2 girls and then a boy. I always thought the girls would be the ones that would be the closest, but it was really the 2 older and the 2 younger. And then they also were they were very close. They loved each other. Phoenix idolized his brother. He adored Reese.
Tell the listeners, if you wouldn't mind, what it was like, and maybe similarities or differences, having to plan a funeral for your kids.
I knew that I just had to get through it. That I needed to do all the things that I needed to do for the funeral so that other people could say their goodbyes and could do what they felt needed to be done to support me. And then I could move on and start taking care of us,
Yeah.
And so within a few hours of the accident, it happened on a Wednesday. We had decided the funeral was going to be Saturday at 10, so that I could just get through it. And it needed to be on a Saturday. They were kids, school-age kids, and they needed to, kids from school needed to be able to come, So I knew it needed to be on a Saturday, but I just wanted to get it over with.
Yeah.
It was really different than Zach's funeral. When he died, the Lord gave me things that I needed to say at his funeral. But when the kids died, I lost my voice for quite some time. But it was really cool because Reese and Maddie stepped up and spoke at their funeral. So it was really neat. And I just kind of I just went through the motions and really didn't connect with anyone. Just didn't have it just knocked the wind out of me. So it was so different because when Zach died, I had all of these things to live for, I had all of this purpose and all of this life in my home that I needed to pour into. But when the kids died, they were the life in my home. And then it was gone in an instant. So it was definitely this period of about a year of just really leaning into the Lord and leaning into my grief and learning to live without, learning to find life in other, or seeking the Lord and asking him to help me learn to find life in other things than my kids.
Yeah. Yeah. When your husband took his life, you had your 4 kids to pour into. When your 2 youngest lost their lives, you were alone. So I'm from this area. I know how the community rallies together.
Yeah, they did.
In times like this, but I also know how the rally of community wanes as time goes on. But you're still left with this weight. How did you start to find yourself again, function again, and believe that you could fulfill purpose again?
Well, the accident happened in February, and I'm a teacher. So it happened in the middle of the school year. And I kind of had this group of kids that, kids have tough stuff too, and so I had been really on them about, you still got to keep moving forward. You have tough stuff, but you can't stay in that. You have to keep moving forward through tough stuff so that you can live life. Hard things happen. And I knew the community did rally together, and there was enough money raised because the kids died at the scene, so I didn't have medical bills. There was enough money raised where I could have stopped working for some time and taken that time to pull myself together. But what kind of a example for those kids would I be if I just selfishly left them hanging so that I could wallow in my terrible circumstance, which nobody would have blamed me for if I did. But what kind of example would I be for those kids if I didn't keep pressing on and keep moving forward and keep living life, even in the midst of tragedy? Because kids have tragedy too, they just don't have the tools that we do to walk through it. And so I knew from the beginning that I needed to go back to work. So I took the days off, the bereavement days that my district offers, and I went back to work. And I just went through the motions,
Yeah.
because sometimes you just have to go through the motions. But I knew that I have greater purpose than being a mom. And no, I don't want to say greater. I have other purpose than being a mom. God has other ways for me to connect with others and to share his love with others than through parenthood, just motherhood. And so you can still be used in all kinds of different places, even when you lose the thing that you're pouring into the most, God can still use you in other ways. And so I knew that I needed to go back to work. So I went back to work. And for the first, until school was out, my mom and my daughter traded off coming to stay with me, because it was just too much for me to imagine coming home to an empty house.
Right.
And waking up to an empty house. And so they got me through the end of the school year. And then I had to sink deeper into the presence of the Lord to sustain me and to get me through those they were very dark days.
The darkest.
Yeah. But I found myself, like I said, going through the motions, just waiting for time to pass so that I could go to sleep, so that then I could wake up and go through the motions again. So watching shows, looking at my phone, just waiting for the time to pass. And it occurred to me, I'm sure it was from the Lord, that time wasn't meant to be wasted. That time of lament wasn't meant to be wasted. That it was a time for me to really lean in to the Lord and to seek him and to spend time learning more about him and searching his word and trusting him to sustain me, even though it was so dark. Because it was. But when Zach died, he taught me that he's my partner. He's my partner. I didn't know, regardless of if I'm in a marriage or not, he's my partner. He's my financial partner. He's my travel partner. He's my partner. He's with me. But when the kids died, he was my sustainer. He sustained me.
Yeah.
So even in the midst of darkness, he was holding me. And I could either just pass the time doing mindless things, or I could really lean into him and trust him to put salve on my wounds. And he's faithful.
Yeah. And in the flesh, it is much easier to zone out, to numb, to spend that time unproductively.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back to what you said about going back to work and being an example for those kids. I know when our daughter died, what I needed most was to know the crap, to know what other people had gone through, had thought, had felt, had experienced when they had lost a baby. And I looked really hard for those things, and they weren't out there. The blogs that people would send me, the articles, I felt like were a very polished, thoughtful reflection after they had sorted through the crap.
Mm.
But when I was going through the middle of it, I wanted to know that was okay. I needed to know that God was bigger than these really big emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So I started writing that blog. I started, the unpolished, we'll say.
Mm-hmm.
I found out later, months, years later, that how cathartic that was for other people who were suffering, and not just suffering from pregnancy or infant loss, but suffering from trauma and tragedy of their own. When you say that you wanted to set an example, do you feel like, yes, it was an example of persevering and being resilient and grounding yourself in the faith, but also in an example of muddling through the mess?
Mm-hmm. I do. Because I was muddling through the mess. I was.
And I think it's important to clarify too, like, even when you say going through the motions, going through the motions after trauma and tragedy includes breaking down.
Mm-hmm. It does.
Brain fog,
Absolutely.
It includes all of these things. It's not just being a robot and getting through the day. There's a lot that going through the motions encompasses.
And that's what I wanted to, when I went home. And in a way too, I guess in a way too, it feels counterintuitive to go back to your life after you've experienced something like that, because all that you really want to do is hide. But going back to my life at school was cathartic for me, because I had a part of my life that wasn't saturated in the loss. It was there. The kids knew it. They knew Phoenix and Peyton, and they knew me, but there was a part of my life that I didn't have to, that, as I said, was not saturated in that loss. I could focus on other things besides muddling through the mess of losing Peyton and Phoenix. And the kids at school were very aware of things, and there were days that I broke down in the lounge and other adults had to come into my classroom for a while. And I mean, it it was just very important for me to come back to life, to live even in the face of tragic loss. And it was important for kids to see that there is life after death. But muddling through the emotion of lament while seeking the Lord and sinking deeper into his presence is imperative. God didn't design us to just ignore the things that we feel and shove them away. That's when we end up with lots of baggage, is when we've shoved things away and never really faced them. He designed us to face the tragedies of this life, or even just the mundane, everyday parts of this life, with him by our side, like walking us through it. And so the going through the motions wasn't about pretending it didn't happen, but it was about continuing to walk forward with him as my sustainer, with him by my side, knowing that he's not finished with me. And their death isn't who I am. It's part of who I am, and it's part of the story that he's given me. And the ways that he's sustained me through that, and that he's redeemed so much in my life, even before that, that's my testimony, And so it sucks and it hurts and I miss them, and they're always there, and I'm not the same, but he's called me to testify of his faithfulness even through the darkest times of our lives. So,
yeah. And it's obvious to me, he sustained you, provided for you, never forsake you, just as all of his promises through scripture tell us is exactly the case. How did you, so for the listener's sake, Brenda is married to Zach today, a classmate of mine.
Yes.
How did you come to a point of being able to trust that you could open your heart again to another relationship and end up marrying Zach, but not just marrying him and now having a husband for the second time in your life, but also now you are parenting with him, a partner in raising his 3 kids?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was definitely an unexpected plot twist for both of us, I think. I've known Zach for over 20 years. We went to church together. We worked at Pizza Hut together. We were couple friends. We played games and made dinners together. And, I lost previous Zach 1. This is Zach 2.0. He's the new and improved version. But I lost Zach 7 years ago, and knew Zach 2.0's wife just kind of changed her ideals. She changed her worldview and chose not to remain in the marriage. So they were just no longer on the same page, and she chose not to remain in the marriage. And after the marriage dissolved, he was very angry, and he kind of had his own walk, and his own period of just being angry at the Lord and just angry in general, and had turned to come back to the Lord and ended up in a class at church, and I was almost a year out from losing the kids and starting to think about, I have never been to counseling. Well, I was in counseling, but I had never really dealt with the things that were in my marriage. It's so hard to explain. You have these patterns of behaviors when you're in relationship. And I wanted to deal with those patterns of behaviors. I hadn't been in a relationship with anybody since my previous marriage. But regardless of God's plan for me, whether it was to ever be married again or whether it was just to be content in a single life, I wanted to deal with those patterns of behaviors. And so I started taking the class. There were three of us and a facilitator in the class. And so he shows up at class and I show up at class, and he was very angry that I was there because he didn't want to spill all his dirt to somebody he knew, but he still came back to class, which is a good thing, a really good thing. But I just had this really deep level of compassion for him. And so I sent him a sermon, and then we just started visiting over Messenger. And God I can't even explain how it happened. The Lord just brought us together, and we didn't even speak face to face for several weeks during class, and we would just speak over Messenger. And then he went on vacation to Florida with Andy. I went to Florida a month before with Tiffany, and then he went to Florida with Andy. So it's just interesting. So we ended up talking on the phone while he was in Florida. And the Lord, through this whole time that we were connecting, I was seeking the Lord because I know God is so good. Like if we ask him to show us, he'll show us, And so anytime any other men had been interested, he'll show us if it's something to pursue or something to let go. And if you don't listen and you go ahead and pursue it anyways, it kind of hurts. And he continues to show you. So I had already been in a situation where I let it go on for too long and should have just listened to the Lord in the first place. So I was really careful anytime a man was talking to me at all, just to really immediately start seeking the Lord to know if it's something that should go further. And the only thing that I had gotten from the Lord was nothing, which was different for me because the Lord was like hard nose on everybody else. So there was just nothing with Zach. And then we were talking over the phone, and when he was in Florida, and he knew that the Lord was giving me nothing. I told him over the phone. So we thought, okay, well, maybe we should just kind of move forward a little and see what God does. And he prayed with me over the phone, and the Lord was like, yes. There was this feeling, I hate to call it a feeling. It was the presence of the Holy Spirit. I've never had, it was crazy. So it was like this big yes. And so as we continued to move forward, it all unfolded really quickly. And what the Lord was through class, what the Lord was really teaching me was that I can trust him. He is my father. He has good gifts for his children. I am his daughter. I can trust him to give me good gifts because I was really firmly in the place of everything for God's glory, but really forgetting, always leaving off that my good. And so I'm like, okay, everything for God's glory, even when it hurts, it's just going to hurt. And that's okay, for God's glory, for God's glory, for God's glory. But I'm his daughter and he loves me and he has good gifts for me. Even when there are things that happen in my life that hurt, he has good gifts for me and I can trust that. And he was almost giving me this object lesson with Zach, that yes, he has good things for me and I can trust him. It's not all about my pain for his glory. It's about my life for his glory. And something that he was really, it was just a cool lesson. I know that life can change for the worse in the blink of an eye. I know that life can change in ways that you are never going to be the same in the blink of an eye, but it can also change for the better in the blink of an eye. Like, this God is God. He's huge, and we can trust him. We can trust that he has good for us, and it's all for his glory. And so we started with the phone conversations. We're in March. We got engaged because we decided we were not dating to date. We were dating to get married. And so then let's just get married. So we got engaged Easter. And because we had kids at home and we really wanted the kids to be involved in the wedding, and we wanted to share our love story with our friends, we waited and had a wedding in July. But I kind of think we would have just gone and eloped if we didn't have kids at home and we didn't have those feelings of wanting to share. So the Lord was really interesting in that, though, because he was teaching me to trust him. And he was very clear with me until I had the ring on my finger. And then it's not that the Lord was telling me no, but the Lord just stopped telling me yes again. And I had to trust him, just trust that I'd heard from him. And so as we're walking through the preparations for the wedding, I just had to trust that this is what the Lord already told me this is what the Lord had already told me was for me. And it was okay for me to hold on to that, even if he wasn't currently saying, yes, Brenda, yes, it's okay, keep moving forward. I could trust the things that he had already said to me. So it's been pretty awesome. Now we've been married for a year, and step parenthood is so different. So different.
Yeah. Talk about that a little bit.
You have to, as a step parent, you still do all of the things that a biological parent does, but the relationship isn't the same. And that's okay. It's not made to be the same, but it's just a challenge. It's just a challenge because I know I'm a good mom, but the relationship between a mother and a child is very different with stepkids. And so just learning to negotiate that and just seeking the Lord on that, loving those kids. I kind of think that the world says that we should love our stepkids like we love our own kids, but we're just kind of supposed to love everybody, and serve everybody and care for everyone scripturally. And I don't think God expects it to be the same as your own kids. It's a completely different relationship. And I wouldn't want it to be either, because they have a mom. And I don't ever want to do anything that makes them feel disloyal to their mom, And so but I still have to care for them the same way that I would my own. But it's just so different. So I'm just new to this world and negotiating and praying about it. And it's really not for the faint of heart. No, it's an interesting relational thing that the Lord has called me into. So again, it's just a place where you have to ask him to show you how to navigate things that are so unfamiliar.
After hearing your story, Brenda, if there's one thing you are not, it is faint of heart. So you got that base covered. If you could, I have to say, you and I did not know each other before this episode. I feel like I know you pretty well right now by the end of it. You have just been encouraging and sharing the redemption of everything you've been through our entire conversation. If you could continue that encouragement and leave the moms listening, maybe they're not even a mom yet, but you know the hardballs life can throw. What would you say to just encourage them to keep walking, keep stepping forward, keep moving in faith?
I would say, a lesson that the Lord taught me when I lost Zach 1, because I was like, where's my purpose? Half of my purpose is gone. I'm not a wife anymore. It's like, what do I do? And actually, really the same thing happened after I lost the kids. It was that part was really similar, but the Lord just walked me through this lesson of, I have called you to love me and to love people, and that is your purpose. And so regardless of the place that you are in life, I've put you where you're supposed to be, and I've called you to love me and to love people. And so wherever you are, whatever you're walking through, your purpose never changes. Never. Love God, love people.
I can't think of a better way to wrap up the episode. I want to express my sincere thanks and gratitude for you being willing to come on. And we know a lot of the same people, but not each other. And so we were essentially strangers, but trusting me enough to help you facilitate and share this story. I can't thank you enough. I think I'm changed by it.
Well, thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And the Lord, if God's going to give me opportunities to share my story, I've got to do it. And so I thank you for facilitating that.
Absolutely. Listeners, I pray that you are encouraged and uplifted today, motivated, inspired by Brenda's story. And Brenda, thank you again for coming on the Motherhood Experience.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the Motherhood Experience podcast. To join our exclusive TME community, head over to themotherhoodexperience.com/learn more. Be sure to follow the Motherhood Experience on Instagram, and please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, leave us a comment below, and we'll catch you next time.